Silver Fox, the Third Confession. Excerpt read by the author. The reason the medical examiner found oxycodone in Shanann's system is because I gave it to her. Chris Watts, April 23, 2019. Chapter 11. The Silver Fox's Greatest Trick. Sometimes the best hiding place is the one that's in plain sight. Stephanie Meyer. Just as the public are easily deceived regarding the stagecraft around the toxic tentacles of oxy and the subtleties of pharmacodynamics, they've underestimated the chemical properties of oil. Oil is an odd compound, chemically speaking. Although water is denser than oil, oil is more viscous than water. Yet despite this viscosity, oil has the quality of being more slippery than water. This has to do with the molecular forces between the molecules of oil, which, like any lubricant, can form extremely thin films even at high temperatures, while resisting and remaining resilient to extreme pressure. Although oil does not mix with water, and for this reason dead bodies might float on oil and take longer to dissolve, there are chemicals inside the body that do dissolve in oil, other oils for instance. Whether animal oils or vegetable oils, oil is soluble in oil. To understand the chemical nature of oxy intuitively, think of oxy as plant nectar. In fact, it's found and synthesized from a terrestrial species of orchid, Epipactis helleborine. Nectar contains alkaloids and polyphenols, the same ingredients as oil. The tobacco plant, for example, contains benzyl acetone. While oxy isn't an oil exactly, it is soluble in alcohol, and while water can't mix with oil, a mixture of alcohol and water can dissolve in oil. Oxy is derived from poppy flower stalks, an alkaloid derived from paramorphine, otherwise known as codeine methyl enyl ether, or thebaine. Petroleum products contain relatively large amounts of nitrogen, which are also found in alkaloids, as well as ethanols and octanes, the precursors to alcohol. In some plain petrochemicals are complex combinations of chemical compounds, and within these lattices lie the formulas for dissolving the fatty components of human tissue, as well as additional organic chemical compounds. Somewhere in all of that complexity are the molecular tools to undo the nuts and bolts of the oxy alkaloid. Just as the idea that oxy can't bring about a miscarriage in a fetus, yet it can easily kill an adult, it is anathema to suggest human bodies can dissolve to nothing in crude oil, but not naturally occurring alkaloids found within these plant and animal organisms. True Crime Rocket Science has maintained from the outset that the children were sedated. The fact that no sedatives were found in the toxicology, regardless of whether these results were withheld or not, misses the obvious molecular mechanism. And it's this area that is the Silver Fox's greatest triumph against truth. The children's bodies weren't dumped in the tanks to hide them, or to separate them, or for any other reason than to destroy evidence. Not only the evidence of the human forms, but the invisible traces within them, the traces he put inside them. The traces he put inside them. It was hiding this most abominable act by disposing of them in the most obvious place, and it worked. Even when people knew where the bodies were disposed of, they haven't been able to figure out why such a heinous burial was necessary. Well, it was to conceal something more heinous. And yes, it is more heinous to overdose one's children in their sleep, to lace their dinner with their mother's deadly painkiller drug, and then blame their mother for their murders. As distasteful as the acts were, dumping a dead body in an oil tank is no more or less painful for the victim than granting them a proper burial. Whether their bodies were dropped inside a scalding volcano or shot out into space, Bella and Cece wouldn't have felt it. Their deaths from an overdose, they wouldn't have felt either. But that's not the point. The point is, by killing them in this way, we see precisely how calculated and cold-blooded the silver fox could be. It was simply because his own children were in the way of his starting a new life with a new wife and allowing her to be the first and the best choice to raise a new brood of fox pups. To do that, the pups at home had to be done away with, a simple equation of pluses and minuses, but the reality of a father playing custodian 1 second and sly, deadly predator the next, seemingly on a whim. This is the real terror, not the oil or the oil tanks. Almost as frightening is the fact that so many, by far the majority following this case, remain unaware of this reality. Most continue to believe him. Even in their disbelief, the sly silver fox still holds them in his fictitious thrall. The strange situation we find ourselves in today is, despite all the secrecy, the autopsies revealed very little, if anything. And perhaps this is why they were kept secret. Had Watts known how little was known, would he really have pursued the plea deal? That was Silver Fox, the Third Confession. Silver Fox, the Third Confession is the first book in the Silver Fox trilogy. So what I've done in this excerpt of the chapter is I've read approximately 2/3 of the chapter. There's another section that's approximately just less than a page long that sort of just deals with some other aspects. It sort of goes a little bit into the Casey Anthony case and the whole sort of idea of how one can use household products as a murder weapon, specifically with reference to chemicals. Increasingly we see this happening. We see that chemical products are used, household chemical products are used conventionally in the execution of crimes, especially when it's crimes within the home or crimes against family members. A very typical product that is used in the disposal of evidence and the cleaning up of evidence is bleach. It's something you find virtually in all high-profile criminal cases. In the Patrick Frazee case, we've just gotten fascinating insight from someone who's basically an accessory after the fact, but basically Frazee's mistress spoke about the effort she did to clean up the crime scene. Now, the crime scene in the Frazee case was completely different to the Watts case. The Watts case, there was no murder weapon, and by murder weapon I mean some kind of blunt instrument or knife or gun or whatever. In the Frazee case, there was a murder weapon, and then there was also a bloodbath. So the crime, the execution of the crimes couldn't be more different. The disposal of the bodies is similar in the sense that they both went to a lot of evidence to move the remains from the scene, and then also went to some effort to destroy the actual remains. And you often get this in the case where there are family members, just because the taboo of committing a crime against your own family is so shameful, and nobody knows that better than the murderers themselves. I have to admit that despite the expertise, sorry, just to go back to something I'd mentioned earlier, I didn't quite complete the point, was that the mistress of Frazee described, how she went through the crime scene, and she talked about, that she took bleach from her home. She couldn't remember the brand of it, but she took bleach from home and dressed basically in the equivalent of a hazmat suit, wearing gloves, um, wearing a hairnet, and taking garbage bags into the scene. And what that tells us is how one can not be an expert, and yet, she was a nurse. Crystal Kenny is a nurse, and she managed to basically conceal the entire crime scene, just to the extent that the investigators couldn't really find anything. And so it just shows you how, someone who, I guess, watches CSI, and amazingly enough, someone, who discussed the Frazee case, said that it sort of looked like, someone had watched this on TV and was just copying it out. And that's again an intertextuality. In any event, coming back to the Silver Fox's Greatest Trick, the chapter in Silver Fox, what I wanted to address was that sort of, murky and kind of fairly recondite area of, chemicals. And I'm not a chemical engineer. I had a bit of chemistry at school, and I think even at university studied it briefly. It's not an area I claim to be very knowledgeable on, but there are some sort of basic aspects, which is dealing with the pH of different, products and different chemicals, and then just understanding the basics of how oil works. One thing that I left out of the excerpt, but that is actually in the book, is it's a fact that, oil is basically dissolved dinosaurs. It's basically dissolved forests. It's basically dissolved, algae. And in fact, that's sort of the majority of what oil is. It's algae deposits in the ocean that have come under pressure and heat over time, and then that sort of, if you imagine this sort of green goo, this sort of oily green goo, over time it becomes, an oily black goo, which is more, of a sort of intensive, chemical product. It's got more, it's more toxic, and it's got more of a sort of intense, it's more of an intense compound. And so the idea that, if you think of all the sort of cadavers, over time, eons of time, whether it's microscopic cadavers of algae, or whether it's, forests or dinosaurs or whatever, you have a situation where the one cadaver becomes reduced to kind of a goo, and then that starts, breaking down certain parts of another, if that makes sense. And it's not as though, it necessarily breaks down everything in one go. Certain parts are more sort of susceptible to being broken down, and other parts not. It's also why, when a human body, decomposes in a normal process, how it happens is the flesh decomposes and the bones are left behind, and it might take very long for the bones to, be sort of reduced to dust. It will eventually happen, but it takes much longer. And so what's quite interesting is, if you look at trees, for example, trees can be decomposed where some of the tissues inside the tree are, destroyed, but then other tissues are actually kind of infiltrated, in some cases, in some rare cases, by, certain, chemicals and certain, processes, and then what happens is these structures get then replaced by muds and particles in the ground, and then they solidify and become, fossils, and they sort of go from being the sort of bones of a tree to being the rock of a fossil. And I've seen them, I've sort of walked on them in Namibia, where you sort of see these vast trunks of ancient forests. This is a desert in the present day, but these forests used to be there, and now what you see are these large structures on the ground, these large horizontal structures, which are rock to the untrained eye, but it's actually fossilized trees. And so you see how you have the selective process of certain parts are dissolved and other parts are almost sort of infiltrated by certain particles in the ground, and then they sort of replace those particles in the tree. And so you have this really sophisticated process going on that turns organisms from one state into another, and when it comes to oil, that is fairly rapid. You have the dissolving of the adipose, and the skin quickly sort of degloves and so on, but it wouldn't take very long for the entire body to completely disappear. It wouldn't happen in one sort of it's a step-by-step process that's sort of in a series. It doesn't all happen kind of at the same time in a certain sense. So you need the first set of breakdowns to happen in order for the next set to sort of be possible, if that makes sense. You have that, and then you also have the compound scenario where other kind of processes are going on simultaneously. So you've got to sort of see it as, it's almost like the narrative of, say, something like Game of Thrones. You're kind of having things happening in parallel, but then you also having processes that are going on that follow on from one another, if that makes sense. And so once this scenario is complete, you then have the processes coming together at a point, and that's when the oil is formed, or where whatever is being broken down is reduced ultimately to oil. In previous narratives to the Silver Fox narrative, I did go into the mechanisms of oil, and I specifically wanted to know not how do certain chemicals potentially break down in oil. I wanted to know how does the human body break down, and this was really, really difficult information to get hold of. There's very little in true crime. There's very little precedent for this, especially in high-profile cases. It's often when someone has been dumped in oil, there is just no trace. So there's no sort of precedent for, after so many days, this is the result. After so long, that's the result. It tends to be a situation of when people are put into oil, well, they're just never seen again. They put in an oil drum, and then there's just nothing left, kind of thing. So this was a difficult case to find analogies to, and one had to then go and literally research the properties of oil and the properties of living things, and see how they worked. And again, that was also quite a niche area and not very easy to find, but I did cover that in the Two-Face series. So what was important, a box that I wanted to tick off in Silver Fox, and what was important just to address was, first of all, a lot of people have been saying all this time that, oh, well, why isn't it in the autopsy? If oxy was a factor, why isn't it in the autopsy? It's a good question, but there's also, one needs to address that question and say, is it possible that it wouldn't have come up in the toxicology? Bear in mind, when the children's bodies were retrieved from the tanks, the liquid from those tanks was sequestrated, and it was pumped into a container truck, and that container truck then left the scene. So certainly from that perspective, it doesn't sound like they sort of preserved that oil and sort of kept it for analysis later. In fact, in that action, there's almost this sort of admission that there would be no point in doing that. In other words, even if you had to scientifically analyze all of that oil product, and it was many hundreds of gallons, your chance of finding these tiny traces would have been minimal, and very likely, um, um, even if it was there, it would have been destroyed. The other aspect that I found quite interesting is the fact that if the oil was sort of, degloving is when the skin of the human body starts to kind of slip off. It doesn't necessarily happen when one is in oil. It can also happen, and it does happen just normally. When someone has died, their body shrinks, their body shrivels, and certain aspects of the body sort of, how can I put it, separate from themselves. So the digestive system shuts down, excrement is flushed out, and all sorts of horrible things like that happen. Blood pools in certain areas. If there's any thing in the digestive canal, it, especially higher up, it may digest to some extent after death. But you kind of have all these systems shutting down, and the body just starts to fall apart. And part of that process is degloving. And so this raised also the important issue of, if the children were strangled and there were bruises, would you see them? If the children were hurt in some way, would you see them? And we kind of have two answers to this question. And the one is that it's amazing that you, despite being suspended in oil, you do see some artifacts with Bella. You don't seem to see any with Celeste, which and the reason may be because she was in more oil. So it may be that the oil did its job with Celeste, and with Bella, those injuries were not destroyed. That's an assumption. It could also just be that Bella was more forcibly pushed through the hatch, which does seem likely. But bear in mind, there's also less oil in that particular tank. So that's the one area. The other area is when you look at Shanann, there's no oil getting in the way there, and Shanann's autopsy showed a very strange lack of injury. And so what that is showing you is very likely the murderer's effort to not have a sort of a severe traumatic confrontation, a horrible struggle with his wife, who's very able-bodied, who's almost his age, who was strong. He found a way to avoid some kind of physical confrontation. It's very likely that the exact same psychology played out with the children. And so it's this criminal psychology that I also wanted to address via this chapter titled, The Greatest Trick the Silver Fox Ever Pulled, which is through the discussion around how the oxy would be destroyed. And bear in mind, no one would know better than an oil worker of what, they would have done courses about this, they would have spoken informally amongst themselves about it. They would be aware firsthand, looking at how oil and oil gas corrodes metal and reduces metal to rust and just changes that sort of thing. They would be aware more than anyone else, when you approach an oil well, how your eyes begin to water and then begin to burn. They would have experienced it firsthand, how the skin on their arms or hands could sting and burn just from exposure, just to in situ exposure of these very, very toxic and nauseating and noxious chemicals. So I wanted to address not so much the mechanism of the oxy and the oil, but much more the psychology of it. It's important to know the mechanism, but it's also important to know why did he use the oil tanks? Why not just anywhere else? And this chapter addresses that. So Silver Fox is the first book in the Silver Fox trilogy. It's currently a number 35 Amazon bestseller in the hoaxes and deceptions category, which is a pretty competitive category. There are books like Catch Me If You Can in the same section by Frank Abagnale. The famous movie was based on that. That book's got 784 reviews, and that book is ranked number 40. There are a couple of books by William Phelps. Also, there's another one that is number 41. Two-Face, The Mysterious Mistress is ranked number 42. After that, there's a book on Lady Diana. Following that, there's another one of my books on Rebecca Zahau at number 47. There are quite a few Anne Rule books in this particular category. But Silver Fox is at number 35, and one book behind Two-Face, The Man Underneath Christopher Watts, the first book in the Two-Face series. Silver Fox was published on October 23rd, 2019. It's relatively short at 139 pages. And it is free on Kindle Unlimited. Otherwise, it is $9.19. And then just to quote from one of the current 8 reviews, by the way, if you have read this book and enjoyed it, please do review it. Anyway, this review was left November 2nd, so a couple of weeks ago. I'm just going to read the review. Not your typical Kindle book. The author is the real deal. Thanks for that. A true crime writer of many books. Sensitive material is treated with reverence. I read all 9 of the first series on the Watts case by this author, and now the Silver Fox series provides deeper insight into the murderer himself. You will be challenged to think critically, sometimes even beyond your comfort zone. As with the other books, I could hardly put it down. The author has written extensively about other recent crime cases, which I have read most of those as well. This is not some fly-by-night quick narrative. This is serious research and another outstanding job for your consideration. Thanks very much for that review. Thank you for listening, and if you haven't read any of the books in the Two-Face series or Silver Fox, please go to Amazon and check them out.